I'd love to talk to you about Vladimir Putin, sort of while we're on this feeling and wave of empathy and trying to understand others that are not like us. One of the reasons I started this podcast is because I believe that there's a few people I could talk to. Some of it is ego, some of it is stupidity. Is there some people I could talk to that not many others can talk to? The one person I was thinking about was Vladimir Putin.
One of the things I want to do better in 2025 is to take this whole YouTube thing a tad more seriously and be a little bit more consistent with my uploads. And what better way to start that than to call out one of the biggest podcasters in the world for being a potential asset for the Kremlin. Lex Fridman is a massively influential media figure who essentially goes around interviewing all sorts of people, specialists within a given industry, ranging from tech bros all the way through military specialists to people like John Mearsheimer, an American political scientist who has officially admitted to receiving money from the Valdai Club, a Russian Moscow-based think tank. Lex went on a trip to Ukraine during the Russian invasion to interview people there, and recently has gained even more popularity by interviewing Donald Trump, the upcoming co-president of America, who also happens to be a rapist, Javier Milei, the seance-performing pro-black market president of Argentina, and now having booked an interview with Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine. Full disclosure, I absolutely adore Lex's content, by and large at least. His style of podcasting, where it's just people sat down talking to each other, is my favourite kind of content, especially since very often it's genuinely informative as hell. No dogshit flashy editing, no strange Minecraft parkour gameplay in the background aimed to hook in the ADHDers hiding in the crevices, limits on monologuing, just two people sat down and talking. Everyone gets their turn to make their case, and Lex's empathetic approach to the conversation makes him very pleasant to listen to. That's actually how I found out about him, through him interviewing a content creator I used to watch quite a lot. It was through my enjoyment of his content that I started picking up some very sussy Baka vibes, especially when it came to Lex's opinions on Vladimir Putin, the dictator of Russia, and Lex's treatment of a few Ukrainian people. That's when I started listening more. I started paying closer attention, and soon thereafter realized I can make a case for why Lex Fridman is compromised. Now, not in the way that many others are, like Jackson Hinkle, where the very public support of Kremlin gets rewarded with a Russian wife who later divorced him and trashed him on social media, so now he's not just spineless but also maidenless, which in fairness I would be pretty sympathetic towards if not for the fact that I landed my bow without betraying my nation in the process. And also, not in a way that someone like Tucker Carlson is compromised, for instance, which probably comes from a deep homoerotic infatuation with the president of Russia and the power he wields. No, Lex's shilling for Russia is far more extraordinary than that. He of course has moments like he did 4 years ago in his interview with Dan Carlin, where he says that he admires the man Putin was when he came into power, seemingly either unaware or without a care for the fact that Putin's entire existence is mired in corruption and murky detail. For example, even back then, right before his presidency in '99, Putin would talk about the need to crack down on the Chechen separatists, who were blamed for the hundreds of deaths in bombings of apartment buildings in Moscow 2 days before his official appointment as prime minister, which then led to him sending thousands of ground troops into Chechnya. Now, it is possible that these bombings did in fact happen as a result of Chechen terrorists, even though absolutely no evidence was produced to this end. I'm merely pointing out the interesting timing of a terror attack in Moscow that granted Putin more power and came at the hands of the very group he wanted to crack down on.
Now, I read every English written biography on Putin, so I need to think more deeply. But one of the fascinating things is, how did power change Vladimir Putin? He was a different man when he took power than he is today. I actually, in many ways, admire the man that took power. I think he's very different than Stalin and then Hitler at the moment they took power. I think Hitler and Stalin were both, in our previous discussion, already on the trajectory of evil. I think Putin was a humble, loyal, honest man when he took power. The man he is today is worth thinking about and studying.
That being said, I'm sure there are plausible explanations to Lex saying this, and by itself, it's not evidence of that much. In the very same interview, he also states that his family is pretty pro-Putin, and every time he receives any word that is strictly anti-Putin, it comes from these young activist types, you know?
I actually don't have real family in Russia who don't love Putin. The only people who write to me about Putin and not liking him are like sort of activists who are young, right? But like, to me, they're strangers. I don't know anything about them. The people I do know who have a big family in Russia, they love Putin.
Maybe to this you would say that this is simply his lived experience, and I'm reading too much into it by noticing that he's crafting a narrative of a strong leader who only gets domestic criticism from youngings who are just too young and too silly and do not know the harsh truth of life. I would disagree with you, but maybe when Lex's guest implies that it's a position of Western privilege to criticize a dictator for being a dictator, and Lex seemingly remains silent in agreement, they're truly onto something. As an Eastern European, I'd say they're full of shit, but what do I know, eh?
He took power when Yeltsin gave him one of the big sort of acts of the new Russia was, for the first time in its history, a leader could have continued being in power and chose to give away power. That was the George Washington.
Right. We in the United States would look at that as absolute positive. Yeah. A sign of good things. Yes.
Yes. And so that was a huge act. And Putin said that was the defining thing that will define Russia for the 21st century, that act, and he will carry that flag forward. That's why in rhetoric, after 2 terms, he gave away power
to Medvedev.
Yeah.
But it was a puppet, right?
Yeah. Yes, but
Okay.
still the story was being told. I think he believed it early on. I believe he still believes it, but I think he's deeply suspicious of the corruption that lurks in the shadows.
Maybe you know Tucker Carlson. If you do not, then I sincerely envy you and apologize for poisoning your life with his existence. Tucker is an American political commentator who used to be the face of Fox News, at many points the most watched news show in cable news. He's also a deluded conspiracy theorist who was fired from Fox after the Dominion lawsuit, which found that Tucker, amongst many others, knowingly aired false information regarding the 2020 American election. To put it in simple terms, when Donald Trump, upon his loss in 2020, cried about voter fraud related to the Dominion voting systems, Tucker Carlson knew that the voter fraud was not true, and he still went on the air and said that it is in fact true and the vote was in fact rigged. I'm not telling you all of this for no reason. Like I said earlier, Tucker and many others frankly have a homoerotic obsession with Putin. Putin, being aware of this, extended a welcoming hand and invited Tucker to interview him in Russia, which Tucker gladly accepted. What was Lex's reaction to it? Supportive, of course. Makes sense, really, and it's not that big of a deal. After all, we know that he was also aiming for presidential interviews. There were obvious problems, however, with the notion of this interview, and a Frontlines volunteer and a supporter of the Ukrainian army, Anna, called him out for it. Now, if you happen to be a human with a fully functioning brain, or at least a partially functioning brain, or a somewhat functioning brain at the very least, this call-out made sense. After all, we already knew at this point that Tucker has no issues with lying to people's faces so long as there is profit in it for him. In what could be more profitable for now a host of his own show than an exclusive interview with one of the most notorious men on the planet? Lex Fridman, being in favor of honest conversations and wanting to bridge gaps wherever he can, respectfully responded to Anna, explained himself clearly, and made a convincing argument for the value of such an interview, especially since Putin's desire to lie will be apparent and easy to fact-check. All of this made it so that I was fully confident that Lex, in fact, is not an agent of Kremlin, and I have nothing at all to worry about. Is what would have happened in a better timeline. Not in ours though, because in our timeline, Lex said none of that and simply immediately blocked Anna. Anna essentially called Tucker a retard, and Lex did not like that at all. Fast forward a bit and this interview did take place. Tucker Carlson, just like these other people scrolling through the screen right now, didn't let the fact that they're a retard stop them from producing content, and there was nothing left to do but cry ourselves to sleep. Tucker's interview is available online for you to watch, and during it, Putin kept lying through his teeth as Carlson was throwing laughably soft questions at him, unable to actually call him out on anything. You can find a number of fact checks and videos dismantling the entire interview. It served no purpose bar a propaganda piece for Putin. Not just that, but during his trip to Moscow, Tucker deadass made a video glazing the shit out of Russia because it was his first time seeing a coin-operated shopping cart. That's not a joke, by the way. If you thought the politicians who do not know the price of bread are removed from reality and cannot be trusted, this motherfucker has never seen a coin-operated shopping cart before.
All right, here we go. So I guess you put in 10 rubles here, and you get it back when you put the cart back. So it's free, but there's an incentive to return it and not just bring it to your homeless encampment. Okay.
As it so happens, Anna was not the only person Lex blocked upon first show of criticism. You see, Lex travelled to Ukraine and conducted a number of interviews with a wide variety of people involved in the war effort. Two noteworthy individuals were Ilya Ponomarenko, a war reporter from Donbass, and Mikhailo Fedorov, a Ukrainian politician and businessman. The reason why those two interviews specifically are noteworthy is because Lex told us he conducted them and then never released them. A number of people have asked why, and, just curious, sort of, we kind of want to see them, and then they were all promptly blocked. This tendency to block anyone who even dares to disagree has gotten bad enough that Lex made a statement on the topic, a statement in which he brings up Ukrainian bot farms attacking him, because that's apparently a thing that happens. Post-editing Chris here. I do want to clarify because this bit might have been a little bit confusing. I know that he says in that screenshot that he disagrees with the Ukrainian bot farm statement, but it still feels weird for him to bring it up. It's like he wants the statement to receive attention and for the idea of these Ukrainian bot farms to take root, but also wants the credit for standing above it all and disagreeing with it, I suppose. Maybe I'm reading too much into it. Admittedly, like you can probably tell at this point, I'm not a big fan of his general take when it comes to anything Ukraine related and sort of how fond of Putin he appears to be. But it just has too much of a conman vibe. Why bring it up at all when Ukrainian bot farms isn't a common talking point, Why not just ignore that part and actually respond to the criticism rather than try and find any way you can to not genuinely address the situation when we already have evidence that you are lying to us? Where he clarified that he never actually intended to release all of his interviews as standalone episodes and instead only recorded a tiny number of them. That would be a fair response, except I have a pretty good inside source pointing to this not being the case at all. And this inside source is Lex Fridman himself. Firstly, in July of 2022, he himself said that he will release what he recorded soon, and then he further clarified on Reddit from his personal account that he will be releasing the footage. You can argue that the question asked technically if he plans to release some of the interviews, so I did just get lawyered, but why did he never mention that he didn't actually intend to release them until right now? Why up until this exact point, when somebody would inquire about these interviews, he just blocked them? As recently as within 24 hours of him releasing the clarifying statement that he never planned to let us see those interviews we're asking about anyway, he was still blocking people who were asking for those. At this point, you should begin to wonder, just like many of us did, is there some f***ery afoot? He admires what kind of man Putin was when he took over. He believes Putin is ridding Russia of corruption and making it a better place. He interviews people knowingly paid by Kremlin. He blocks a Ukrainian who disagrees with his support of Tucker Putin interview. And then he blocks a whole shitload of people asking for why he is not releasing certain interviews to a point where it forced him to do a written response, which doesn't just barely address the situation, but can be reasonably interpreted to be a lie. The thing that boggles me is that, after all, everything I just brought up has some kind of a viable explanation. Some explanations are a bit far-fetched, others less so, but all in all, viable. Like I said, there is no smoking gun here. So then why am I getting all worked up and thinking the worst of him? Why am I assuming that those reasonable explanations aren't cutting it? Remember when I mentioned he has a family in Russia? That's why, at least partially. Many people are unaware of Lex's upbringing, and many more are still unaware of what happens to influential people and their families when they cross Putin. To those of you who paid attention to Anna's tweet from earlier, you might have already seen this. Lex, or more accurately, Alexei Fedotov, was born in Tajikistan to Ukrainian parents. Both Tajikistan and Ukraine were part of USSR at this point in history, and Lex was raised in Ukraine, Russia, and the USA. Pretty cool, mixed background, but what I currently want to focus on is his pro-Putin family. We all have our own biases. Many of us come from households whose leading politics we strongly disagree with. It's pretty normal, really. But not many of us have a family living in a place controlled by a dictator who not only commands full ownership of the media, but also has a penchant for disappearing, if you know what I mean, his opposition. There are whole lists of influential people in Russia who were in one way or another opposed to Putin or his interests, who got assassinated or just went missing in murky circumstances and were never found. It is estimated that at least 21 journalists have been killed in Russia since Putin came to power. Lex Fridman goes around interviewing massively powerful and influential people, and if you think he's too small of a fish to be on Putin's radar, think again. Especially given that come Monday, he's about to release his interview with the president of Ukraine. But this isn't where the rabbit hole ends. You see, when you go on Lex's wiki page, you won't find his real name anymore. And it used to be there. His current page reads that he is an American computer scientist and podcaster. But before that, his Wikipedia page used to read that he is a Ukrainian-American computer scientist and a podcaster. And then even before that, his Wikipedia page used to have his full birth name and used to read that he is a Russian-American computer scientist. So interesting how his page changed shortly after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Except that this again has a plausible explanation. A lot of people born in the Soviet Union refer to themselves as Russian. That's pretty normal, and many Ukrainians specifically have stopped using that since the invasion. But he doesn't call himself Ukrainian either, so that's not quite the angle here seemingly. He kinda addresses these changes right here.
About the biography there also starts becoming important for the first time for me. I also want to clarify sort of personally, use this opportunity of some inaccuracies there. My father was not born in Chkalsk, Russia. He was born in Kiev, Ukraine. I was born in Chkalsk, which is a town not in Russia. There is a town called that in Russia, but there's another town in Tajikistan, which is a former republic of the Soviet Union. That town is now called Buston, Buston, which is funny because we're now in Austin and I also am in Boston. It seems like my whole life is surrounded by these kinds of towns. So I was born in Tajikistan, and the rest of the biography is interesting, but my family is very evenly distributed between their origins and where they grew up, between Ukraine and Russia, which adds a whole beautiful complexity to this whole thing. So I want to just correct that.
Now, I'm on board with this explanation, sort of, but let's not kid ourselves. He had his page edited in a manner most beneficial to him, and he did it at a very specific point in history. Post-editing Chris here. I can't be fucked to turn on VTube Studio, so I'll have to make do with just my voice and the shitty GTA ramp gameplay. You remember how earlier I said that I adore his content? I'm really not so sure anymore, so this is some wacky shit that I'm finding out in real time. Take this with a grain of salt, because I didn't have the time for a deep dive, but the rabbit hole goes even deeper. Lex appears to be insanely protective of his image to a degree that causes a ridiculous level of censorship by his hand, which is all the more interesting when you find out that a big rise in his prominence happened when he interviewed Elon Musk, who praised Lex's study into the behavior of drivers using Tesla's semi-autonomous driver system. Unfortunately, that very same study was criticized by AI experts and was not peer-reviewed. The lack of peer review in a study he pushed is particularly fascinating because he was hired by Google and then concluded his employment within 6 months due to him apparently preferring the chaos of research in an academic environment. He just doesn't prefer it enough to allow for peer reviewing, I guess. So following his apparently shite study and interview with Elon, his podcast viewership has absolutely blown up, which is great for him, but MIT actually removed his study from their website completely. I'm gonna be real with you. The more I look into him, the weirder it gets. I can't put my finger on it exactly, but something about him is wildly off. Nobody with these bridge-gapping, truth-seeking, empathy-driven intentions leads a life that is this full of censorship. It looks like at worst he brute-forced an unscientific paper he knew would get annihilated by peer review through using his MIT credentials for no reason other than to gain fame and propel his career forward, when the actual paper itself was so subpar that MIT completely removed it from their website. I would think that if you're a principled researcher worth your salt, you'd never release a paper like that was not peer-reviewed. And he didn't only do that, but then he used it to land an interview with the richest man in the world who was about to become the co-president of America. Like, what the f*** is going on here? Now, the annoying thing whilst doing research for all of this and whilst vibe-checking my way through some of his videos is that I found nothing I could seriously latch onto the way a pit bull does to a 6-year-old. But now we don't only have a track of behaviour that is sussy, and consistently sussy over the years, with a very generous sprinkle of censorship in there, but we have that behaviour be exhibited by an individual who would be uniquely exposed to a lot of pro-Putin propaganda from his own pro-Putin family, and who has the vested interest of wanting to keep his family safe. It really isn't that big of a stretch, in my opinion, to acknowledge that whether on purpose or by happenstance, aligning with Kremlin to a certain extent is not just in Lex's best interest, but also in the best interest regarding the safety of his family. When I call Lex compromised, I don't limit myself to meaning it in the he takes money from Kremlin kind of way. You see, if that was the case and there was evidence of this, you wouldn't be finding out about it from a 2000 subs VTuber with brain rot gaming footage in the background. Such a smoking gun doesn't exist here, or at least I wasn't able to find it. What I do mean, however, is that we might never know Lex's true feelings in certain matters because it would put him and potentially his family in harm's way. And unfortunately, given that despite this he took it upon himself to get involved with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it does mean that we cannot trust a fucking word he says. He is a massively influential figure, and we'll see to what extent my worries are warranted come Monday when he releases the interview with Zelensky. Irrespectively of how it turns out though, Lex Fridman, or Alexei Fedotov, is compromised. Whether he took the knee implicitly or explicitly, willingly or had no other choice, it doesn't change the fact that I can smell Putin's dick cheese on his breath. That'll be it for today, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoyed listening to me yapping as much as I have enjoyed yapping for you. If so, then please do not hesitate to hit the like and subscribe buttons. And if you want to take an active part in my content creation journey, I highly encourage you to join my Discord. Special thanks to my Golden Oni fans and my Patreon supporters. Good night, a belated Happy New Year, and I will talk to you soon. Good night.